Immediately staking a central claim, this pawn advance opens lines for development and contests vital territory. Developing a knight toward the center, this often initiates hypermodern defenses, aiming to control the d4 pawn from afar and allowing for flexible pawn structures later. Immediately seizing central space, c4 aims to disrupt black's flexible nf6 development and challenge for dominion. Embracing the king's Indian setup, black plans to fianchetto their bishop for a dynamic, kingside-oriented game. Solidifying central control, this knight emerges to influence critical squares and prepare for further expansion. Unlocking the fianchetto's diagonal power, this bishop asserts long-range influence, aiming at white's central pawn structure. Asserting central space with e4 bolsters white's influence and restricts black's pieces, setting the stage for a dynamic battle. Solidifying the center with d6 opens lines for the queen's bishop and prepares for development. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies central control and prepares for kingside castling, aiming to harmonize pieces for a harmonious middle game. Securing the king's safety establishes a stable foundation, allowing for flexible development of black's remaining pieces. Developing the bishop to a diagonal that supports the pawn chain and eyes kingside potential. Unleashing central pressure immediately, black aims to destabilize white's pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. Securing the king's safety now allows focus on developing pieces for the central struggle. Initiating development of the queenside knight, this natural repositioning aims to contest central squares and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Seizing central space, white creates an imposing pawn chain, restricting black's knight and preparing a queenside expansion. Redirecting the knight to its own territory grants breathing room, though it concedes valuable central space to white's advancing pawn chain. Shifting the knight to e1 opens lines for the queen and prepares a kingside pawn storm. The knight retreats, rerouting to a more active square on the queenside. Shifting the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the central files and potentially launch an assault. Unleashing a kingside pawn storm, black seeks to shatter white's central pawn chain and activate their pieces, albeit at the cost of potential weaknesses. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge black's central pawn chain while adding support to the kingside. Re-engaging the knight with the central dark squares provides a dynamic option to exploit white's slightly awkward knight placement. Solidifying the pawn structure aims to clamp down on black's kingside initiative. A bold push, this creates a very locked pawn structure, potentially limiting white's space but also creating targets. Unleashing a pawn storm, white boldly aims to pry open the kingside, risking central stability for aggressive king hunting. This pawn advances, a stubborn guard for the kingside, but it undeniably weakens the kingside structure and invites further confrontation. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal aims to contest the central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, but leaves the queenside somewhat exposed. The knight ventures to a promising outpost, eyeing critical central squares and potentially disrupting white's pawn chain. Prying open the queenside now invites dynamic counterplay and potential weaknesses for black's king. Prioritizing defensive integrity, this maneuver fortifies the kingside against white's encroaching pawns and aims to reroute pieces for counterplay. Unlocking the c-file demands careful calculation, as open lines can expose weaknesses for either monarch. Opening the c-file presents a new dynamic, demanding immediate attention to defend that crucial diagonal. Unleashing a queenside expansion to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain space. This repositioning of the bishop aims to prepare for a potential kingside counterplay or to reinforce the central structure. This advance aggressively probes the queenside flank, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering space and create potential weaknesses. Unleashing a flank attack, black aims to puncture white's solidified pawn structure and expose the king. Solidifying your pawn chain, but this kingside advance may create lasting weaknesses to exploit. Seeking to activate the rook, the player pushes it forward, preparing to contest open files and potentially infiltrate the white camp. King's safety concerns arise as the monarch ventures forward, potentially exposing itself to future tactical dangers. Opening that file promises tactical fireworks, but it also exposes your king to the enemy's advancing pawns. Opening that H file creates potential for a swift assault on the exposed enemy monarch. Unburdening the kingside pawn structure offers counterplay, but exposes the king to potential discovery attacks. Bolstering the kingside pawn structure, the bishop now eyes crucial central squares and potential attacking avenues. Charging forward with the knight aims to disrupt white's tight pawn structure and create immediate threats. Exchanging the dangerous knight clears the kingside, simplifying black's attacking prospects while opening the bishop's diagonal. Opening the H-file creates a critical weakness around your king, inviting immediate tactical complications for the black forces. Shifting the knight to F2 strengthens the kingside defense and prepares a potential pawn advance on the kingside. A calculated sacrifice, opening the king's defensive ranks for a potential lightning strike. Solidifying the king's sanctuary against the relentless queenside storm, this repositioning conserves crucial defensive resources. Securing the queenside pawn structure against further incursions, though perhaps a tad passive for the current aggressive disposition. Expanding on the queenside can help alleviate the pressure on your king. Seeking counterplay on the queenside, this push aims to destabilize white's pawn structure and open lines, though it sacrifices valuable central space. Capturing the pawn resolves the queenside pawn tension, opening the file for potential future piece activity. Unlocking the queen's diagonal presence, immediate attacking potential against white's isolated pawns. Opening the queenside for greater mobility and potential piece activity against the somewhat exposed black king. Relinquishing control of the d-file is a significant positional concession, allowing white to potentially activate their rook. Sacrificing the pawn opens a diagonal for the queen and king's attack. Reclaiming initiative, the black bishop disrupts white's queenside structure and eyes potential tactics. Opening the file presents an opportunity to penetrate black's position with rooks. The rook aggressively reclaims the open file, disrupting white's queenside aspirations and eyeing potential breakthroughs. The queen's repositioning aims to exploit the open c-file and potentially support pawn advances on the queenside. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank sets up potential discoveries against white's queen and a squeeze on that flank. Reactivating the rook on the open file is a dynamic attempt to generate counterplay, creating immediate threats against black's queenside. Unpinning the queen and activating it, but the white rook eyes the queenside. Trading queens simplifies the board, relieving immediate pressure and setting the stage for a more strategic endgame battle. Exchanging the queen opens up the possibility for a swift pawn push, creating immediate pressure on the weakened white king. King's safety is now the paramount concern, as the rook penetrates dangerously deep into enemy territory, aiming to exploit the weakened structure. Bringing the rook to the 7th rank aims to contest open lines and potentially create passed pawns in the endgame. Capturing that knight ignites a dangerous tactical skirmish, potentially unraveling black's defenses and opening lines toward their king. Securing that a file rook's dominion prevents a swift white invasion and builds a defensive bulwark. Recapturing the pawn immediately consolidates white's material advantage and prepares to exploit the open b-file for further pressure. Exchanging rooks here surrenders the crucial b-file, opening avenues for white's queen to infiltrate and exploit black's exposed king. A passive recapture opens the d-file, ceding initiative and creating a potential target for black's rook. Asserting control over the open c-file solidifies black's counterplay in this imbalanced endgame. Securing the now open b-file offers a crucial avenue for piece activity and potential pressure. Reasserting piece activity, the knight aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially penetrate into more active squares. Repositioning the knight to a more active square on the kingside, seeking to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king. Suddenly shifting to kingside defense, the bishop aims to reinforce the beleaguered royal family. Repositioning the king to the side of the action, away from any immediate threats on the central files. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square aims to challenge white's control and potentially open lines. Securing the knight's egress from potential pawn enfilades is a pragmatic defensive maneuver. Repositioning the knight to g6 aims to eye the weakened kingside and prepare for potential breakthroughs or defensive maneuvers. Sacrificing the exchange now offers attacking chances on the open e-file, but it also liberates black's rook. Reclaiming the rook's activity is paramount, challenging the centralized white pawn. The rook anchors itself, creating a menacing battery along the third rank, ready to exploit any weakness near the black king. Initiating a tenacious battle for central control, this rook advances to a critical outpost, ready to disrupt white's fragile pawn structure and target weak squares. Unveiling a forceful check, white aims to dislodge the black king from its sanctuary and disrupt black's defensive setup. The king scrambles for safety amidst a tense endgame, seeking refuge from the open file's menace. The monarch's new abode on g2 looks rather exposed to the opposition's bishop. Relinquishing control of the 7th rank allows the rook to penetrate and become a real threat to the exposed monarch. Relocating the monarch to the edge offers an escape from potential tactical skirmishes on the central files. Suddenly, the knight shifts its gaze towards the exposed white king, potentially reigniting a dormant attack on the monarch's safe haven. Capturing the knight opens lines, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and weak pawns. Sacrificing a pawn to activate the rook and challenge, the exposed king seems a bold but potentially sound decision. Activating the knight to harass the isolated pawns and potentially create outpost opportunities. Bringing the rook to the 1st rank creates immediate discomfort for white's king, threatening a forced sequence that could lead to material gain or further positional pressure. Shifting the king back to safety is a sound defensive maneuver. The king's escape route is now definitively shut down, presenting a grim endgame scenario for white. The king's retreat to f1 shores up the immediate checks, aiming for a more stable defensive posture. King's safety is paramount. Forcing the white king into a perpetual check seems the most logical path to avoid a swindle in this endgame. Consolidating the rook and king for a stronger defensive structure against further checks. King's exposure on the open ranks offers a final desperate check. The king scrambles for safety, abandoning the c3 square's defense to an inevitable pawn push. Shifting the rook to the h-file aims to pressure white's king and disrupt their coordination, but it leaves the pawn structure vulnerable. Exposing the king further with a pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's tightly knit defense and chase away the knight. This offers a chance to centralize the king and activate the rook on an open file. King hunts for a safe haven, steering clear of the active enemy rook and pawn threats on the 7th rank. Actively seeking opposition with the rook can be a double-edged sword, potentially forcing perpetual check or allowing the opposing king to escape. Consolidating the king's safety is paramount, seeking refuge from the persistent knight checks. Seizing the open file offers a glimmer of hope to untangle the rook's predicament. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank is a shrewd maneuver, preparing to exploit the open files and potentially trap the black king. Focusing on the open files and the king's exposed position, black's bishop retreats to a more solid defensive square. Seeking to dislodge the intrusive rook and expose the king's weakened defenses. The black king, having outmaneuvered its pursuers, now seeks to consolidate its position and escape the immediate threats. Pushing this pawn offers a tempting path to expose the black king further, though it might overextend. Sacrificing material for perpetual check attempts becomes the immediate focus, a desperate attempt to salvage a draw. Pushing the pawn forward now forces a major decision for black's rook and bishop coordination.